In the late 20th century, Venezuela stood as one of Latin America's most prosperous nations. The country possessed the largest proven oil reserves in the world, and throughout much of the century, it had attracted immigrants from across the globe, offering opportunity and stability that many other nations in the region could not provide. By the 1980s, Venezuela had become known as a beacon of democracy in South America, a place where Europeans and Latin Americans alike sought refuge from political turmoil and economic hardship elsewhere. The nation's wealth, derived almost entirely from petroleum exports, had created a comfortable middle class and funded ambitious social programs. But beneath this veneer of prosperity, deep structural problems were festering. Corruption had become endemic within the political establishment. The traditional two-party system, dominated by democratic action and COPAI through an arrangement known as the Puntafillo Pact, had grown increasingly disconnected from the needs of ordinary Venezuelans. While oil revenues flowed into the country, the benefits were unevenly distributed, and a significant portion of the population remained mired in poverty. The 1980s brought the first serious cracks in Venezuela's economic foundation. When oil prices collapsed during this decade, the country found itself ill-prepared for the downturn. The economy, which had become dangerously dependent on petroleum exports, contracted sharply. In 1983, the bolivar was devalued, and the government was forced to cut back on social welfare programs that many Venezuelans had come to depend on. The standard of living began to decline, and discontent grew among the population. The political establishment seemed unable or unwilling to address these mounting problems. Politicians from the traditional parties continued to govern as they always had, seemingly oblivious to the changing circumstances and the growing frustration of the people. By the late 1980s, Venezuela's economic situation had become dire. Inflation was rising, poverty was spreading, and the government's debt burden was becoming unsustainable. In 1989, newly elected President Carlos Andrés Pérez attempted to address the economic crisis by negotiating a loan from the International Monetary Fund. The loan came with strict conditions. Venezuela would have to implement an austerity program that included significant cuts to government subsidies and social welfare programs. When Pérez announced these measures, including an increase in gasoline prices, the reaction was swift and violent. On February 27, 1989, riots erupted in Caracas. What began as protests against increased bus fares quickly spiraled into widespread looting and social chaos. The government responded with overwhelming force, deploying the military to restore order. The official death toll was put at 275 people, but media sources and human rights organizations claimed that thousands may have been killed. This event, known as the Caracazo, or the Caracas Smash, would prove to be a watershed moment in Venezuelan history. It shattered the image of Venezuela as a stable, harmonious democracy and exposed the deep divisions within Venezuelan society. Among those deeply affected by the Caracazo was a young army officer named Hugo Rafael Chavez Frias. Born on July 28, 1954, in the small town of Sabaneta in the plains of Barinas State, Chavez had grown up in modest circumstances. His parents were both school teachers, but they struggled financially to support their 6 sons. Hugo and his eldest brother were raised by their grandmother, Rosa Inés Chavez, who instilled in young Hugo a love of history and politics. She told him stories of Venezuela's great liberator, Simon Bolivar, and planted in his mind the ideals of independence, justice, and equality. Chavez pursued a military career, entering the Venezuelan Military Academy and graduating as a second lieutenant. But unlike many of his fellow officers who came from privileged backgrounds, Chavez maintained close connections to the poor and working-class communities from which he came. He saw firsthand how economic policies affected ordinary Venezuelans, and he grew increasingly disillusioned with the political establishment. In 1982, while serving as an army officer, Chavez secretly founded the revolutionary Bolivarian Movement 200 with a group of like-minded military colleagues. The movement took its name from the 200th anniversary of the birth of Simon Bolivar, which would be celebrated in 1983. The group's goal was nothing less than revolutionary. They wanted to overthrow Venezuela's existing political system and replace it with one that would serve the interests of the poor majority. For 10 years, Chavez and his comrades worked in secret, recruiting supporters within the military and planning their move. The Caracazo convinced Chavez and his fellow conspirators that the time for action had come. The violent suppression of the protests demonstrated, in their view, that the government had lost all legitimacy and that the military could no longer be counted on to defend an unjust system. On February 4, 1992, Chavez led a coup attempt against President Perez. The plan was complex, involving simultaneous seizures of key military installations across the country. The ultimate goal was to capture President Perez himself and force him to resign. But the coup attempt was plagued by poor coordination and bad luck. While Chavez's comrades successfully captured their assigned targets in other parts of the country, Chavez himself was unable to capture Perez, who managed to escape from the presidential palace. Trapped in the Military History Museum near the palace and realizing that the coup had failed, Chavez agreed to surrender. In exchange for his surrender, Chavez was given the opportunity to address the nation on television and call on his supporters in other parts of the country to lay down their arms. In his brief televised statement, Chavez took responsibility for the failed coup and uttered words that would become famous in Venezuela. "For now," he said, "we have not been able to achieve our objectives." That phrase, "for now," suggested that this was not the end, but merely a temporary setback. Chavez was sentenced to 2 years in prison. During his time in prison, Chavez became something of a folk hero among Venezuela's poor. Many saw him as someone who had stood up to a corrupt system on their behalf. He spent his time in prison reading, studying, and refining his political philosophy. He immersed himself in the writings and ideas of Latin American revolutionary thinkers, and he continued to draw inspiration from the example of Simon Bolivar. In 1994, the government granted Chavez a pardon, and he was released from prison. He immediately began to organize politically, establishing the Fifth Republic movement, a political party dedicated to transforming Venezuela through democratic means. Chavez traveled extensively throughout Venezuela, holding rallies and connecting with voters. His message resonated powerfully with the poor and working class. He promised to end corruption, redistribute wealth, and create a new Venezuela based on principles of social justice and equality. He spoke in plain language that ordinary people could understand, and he positioned himself as an outsider, challenging a corrupt establishment. By 1998, Venezuela's economic and political crisis had deepened considerably. More than half of the Venezuelan population was living below the poverty line. Annual inflation exceeded 30%, and oil prices had fallen to historic lows. The traditional political parties of Democratic Action and COPEI had become deeply unpopular, seen as hopelessly corrupt and out of touch with ordinary Venezuelans. In the presidential election held that year, Venezuelan voters decisively rejected the political establishment. Hugo Chavez won the presidency with 56.2% of the vote, and his coalition won a majority in the legislature. At his inauguration in February 1999, Chavez departed from the traditional presidential oath. Instead of simply swearing to uphold the Constitution, he proclaimed, "I swear before God and my people that upon this moribund Constitution I will drive forth the necessary democratic transformations so that the new republic will have a Magna Carta befitting these new times." This was a clear signal that Chavez intended to fundamentally restructure Venezuela's political system. True to his word, one of Chavez's first acts as president was to call for the election of a constituent assembly to draft a new constitution. The election for this assembly was held in July 1999, and Chavez's supporters won an overwhelming majority of the seats. The new constitution, approved by referendum in December 1999, dramatically expanded presidential power. It extended the presidential term from 5 years to 6 years, eliminated the Senate, and created a unicameral National Assembly, and included provisions that appeared to limit checks and balances on executive authority. The Constitution also enshrined principles that Chavez believed were central to his Bolivarian Revolution. It declared Venezuela to be a participatory democracy, emphasized social and economic rights, and included provisions to protect indigenous peoples and the environment. Critics argued that the Constitution concentrated too much power in the hands of the president and weakened democratic institutions, while supporters maintained that it represented a necessary restructuring to make Venezuelan democracy more responsive to the needs of ordinary people. The ideology that Chavez promoted came to be known as Bolivarianism, or more simply, Chavismo. At its core, it was a form of socialism mixed with nationalism and anti-imperialism. Chavez drew heavily on the legacy and writings of Simon Bolivar, the 19th century revolutionary leader who had led much of South America to independence from Spanish colonial rule. Bolivar had envisioned a united, independent Latin America free from foreign domination, and Chavez positioned himself as the heir to this vision. But Chavez's Bolivarianism went beyond simply invoking historical symbols. It represented a comprehensive critique of the existing economic and political order. Chavez argued that previous Venezuelan governments had allowed the country's oil wealth to be plundered by corrupt elites and foreign corporations, while the majority of Venezuelans remained poor. He promised to use the state's power to redistribute wealth and to ensure that the benefits of Venezuela's natural resources would flow to all Venezuelans, not just a privileged few. Central to Chavez's program were the Bolivarian missions, ambitious social programs designed to address poverty, illiteracy, and lack of access to health care. These missions were launched beginning in 2003 as oil prices began to rise and government revenues increased. Mission Robinson focused on literacy, aiming to teach millions of Venezuelans to read and write. The program used Cuban educators and teaching methods. Mission Barrio Adentro brought health care to poor neighborhoods that had previously lacked adequate medical facilities. Under this program, thousands of Cuban doctors were brought to Venezuela and stationed in clinics in impoverished areas, providing free medical care to residents. Mission Mercal established a network of subsidized food stores where poor Venezuelans could purchase basic staples at reduced prices. Other missions focused on education, housing, and job training. The missions were funded almost entirely by oil revenues, which were flowing into government coffers at unprecedented levels as global oil prices surged in the early 2000s. The impact of these programs was significant, at least initially. Poverty rates declined notably between 2003 and 2007, the period when oil prices were at their highest. Literacy rates improved. Infant mortality decreased. Many poor Venezuelans, particularly those who had been completely marginalized under previous governments, received services and attention for the first time. For these beneficiaries, Chavez became something approaching a savior figure. They attended his rallies by the hundreds of thousands, and they voted for him and his candidates in election after election. But the missions had serious structural flaws. They were not designed to be sustainable or to create lasting institutional capacity. They were funded entirely by oil money, with no plan for what would happen if oil prices fell. They were administered outside the normal structures of government, often with little oversight or accountability. Many of the facilities built for the missions, particularly healthcare clinics, were shoddily constructed and quickly fell into disrepair. The missions also did little to address the underlying structural problems in Venezuela's economy. They provided services and assistance, but they did not create productive economic activity or sustainable employment opportunities. At the heart of Venezuela's economy lay petroleum and the state-owned oil company, Petróleos de Venezuela, or PDVSA. For decades, PDVSA had been one of the most professionally run oil companies in the world, with highly trained engineers and technicians managing exploration, production, and refining operations. But Chavez saw PDVSA as a symbol of the old order, an institution that served elite interests rather than those of the Venezuelan people. In 2002 and 2003, a major confrontation erupted between Chavez and PDVSA management. Senior managers and workers at the company organized strikes to protest Chavez's policies, bringing Venezuela's oil production to a near standstill for weeks. The strikes were eventually broken, but Chavez responded by firing approximately 19,000 PDVSA employees, including many of the company's most experienced engineers and managers. These positions were filled with political loyalists who often lacked the technical expertise necessary to run an oil company effectively. The impact on Venezuela's oil industry was devastating and long-lasting. Oil production, which had been 3.12 million barrels per day when Chavez took office in 1999, declined to approximately 2.95 million barrels per day by 2007, even as oil prices increased by 660% during this same period. Investment in maintenance and new exploration dried up as Chavez diverted PDVSA's revenues to fund his social programs and political projects. The company took on huge debts, borrowing billions of dollars from China and Russia. Equipment was not maintained properly, and accidents and spills became more common. The decline in production continued year after year, even as global demand for oil increased and prices remained high. Analysts estimated that by 2012, PDVSA was only making a profit on approximately 1.4 million barrels per day of production, despite producing much more than that. The rest was either given away to political allies like Cuba at subsidized prices or consumed by the inefficiencies of the poorly managed company. Chavez's approach to managing Venezuela's economy extended beyond the oil industry. He implemented extensive price controls on basic goods, arguing that this was necessary to protect poor Venezuelans from exploitation by greedy businessmen. But economic theory and experience suggest that price controls, when set below market clearing levels, inevitably lead to shortages, and that is precisely what happened in Venezuela. Businesses found that they could not profitably produce or import goods at the prices the government mandated. Some businesses responded by reducing production or halting operations entirely. Others attempted to smuggle goods across the border to Colombia, where they could be sold at market prices. The government responded to these shortages by ordering the military to seize control of food production and distribution facilities. In 2008, Chavez ordered the military to seize 750 tons of food that sellers were attempting to smuggle across the border. In 2009, he ordered the military to take control of rice processing plants and force them to operate at full capacity. In 2010, he ordered the seizure of food from Empresas Polar, one of Venezuela's largest food producers. In 2003, as these economic problems were beginning to emerge, Chavez created CATAV, a currency control board charged with managing foreign exchange. Under this system, the government controlled access to foreign currency, particularly U.S. dollars. Businesses that needed to import goods had to apply to the government for permission to purchase dollars. The government would provide these dollars at an official exchange rate that was typically far below what dollars were actually worth. This created massive opportunities for corruption, as those with connections to the government could obtain dollars at the official rate and then sell them on the black market for enormous profits. It also created severe problems for legitimate businesses, which often could not obtain the foreign currency they needed to import goods and raw materials. The gap between the official exchange rate and the black market rate grew wider and wider over time, reaching absurd levels. The currency control system went through numerous devaluations during Chavez's time in office, disrupting the economy each time and eroding confidence in the Bolivar. Chavez pursued an aggressive program of nationalization, taking over private companies in sectors he deemed strategic or important. He nationalized telecommunications companies, steel companies, cement companies, banks, and agricultural operations. In many cases, the companies that were nationalized were poorly managed under government control, leading to declining production and deteriorating equipment. The nationalization program, combined with hostile rhetoric toward private business and property rights, created a climate of uncertainty that deterred investment. Both domestic and foreign investors became reluctant to put money into Venezuela, fearing that their assets might be seized. This lack of investment contributed to the stagnation and decline of Venezuela's non-oil economy. Manufacturing output fell, and Venezuela became increasingly dependent on imports for basic goods. By 2012, Venezuela depended on oil for 96% of its exports, up from 80% when Chavez took office. The economy had become even more vulnerable to fluctuations in oil prices than it had been before. Chavez also used Venezuela's oil wealth to pursue an ambitious foreign policy agenda. He provided subsidized oil to Cuba in exchange for the services of Cuban doctors, teachers, and security personnel. At its peak, Venezuela was sending nearly 60,000 barrels of oil per day to Cuba, either at favorable payment terms or as a form of trade in kind. He sold oil to other South American countries and to China at below-market rates, seeking to build alliances and extend Venezuelan influence. He was a vocal critic of the United States and used his platform to challenge American dominance in Latin America. He forged close relationships with other leaders who opposed the United States, including Fidel Castro of Cuba, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad of Iran, and Muammar Gaddafi of Libya. These relationships and Chavez's anti-American rhetoric attracted considerable attention and made him a controversial figure on the international stage. As Chavez's presidency progressed, signs of economic strain became increasingly visible. Inflation remained persistently high, hovering around 20 to 30% throughout much of his presidency. This was far higher than in neighboring countries and eroded the purchasing power of Venezuelans. Food shortages became more common, particularly after price controls were implemented. Long lines at grocery stores became a regular feature of life in Venezuela, as people waited for hours to purchase basic items like milk, cooking oil, and toilet paper. The shortages were not caused by lack of food in the country, but rather by the dysfunctional distribution system created by price controls and currency restrictions. Crime rates, which had been relatively low in Venezuela compared to other Latin American countries, began to rise sharply during the Chavez years. In the early 1980s, Venezuela had a homicide rate of around 8 per 100,000 people, similar to peaceful countries like Costa Rica. But by the 1990s, after the Caracazo and the political upheavals of that decade, the murder rate had risen to 21 per 100,000. The Bolivarian Revolution did nothing to halt this rise. According to research by Gareth Jones and Dennis Rogers, the murder rate continued to climb after Chavez took power in 1999. Within 4 years, it had increased from 25 per 100,000 to 44 per 100,000. Chavez and his supporters argued that crime was the result of poverty and inequality, and they believed that their social programs would eventually address these root causes. But the murder rate continued to rise even as poverty fell during the boom years of the mid-2000s. Kidnappings also increased dramatically during the Chavez years. The number of kidnappings in 2011 was more than 20 times higher than when Chavez was first elected. Documentary filmmaker James Brabazon noted that kidnapping crimes skyrocketed after Chavez freed thousands of violent prisoners as part of controversial criminal justice reforms. Colombian organized crime groups also became more active in Venezuela, contributing to the rise in both kidnappings and murders. The government's response to rising crime was largely ineffective. Law enforcement agencies were understaffed, poorly trained, and often corrupt. The judiciary was politicized and inefficient, with an estimated 90% of crimes going unpunished. Prisons became severely overcrowded and were often controlled by criminal gangs rather than authorities. Under Chavez, Venezuela's democratic institutions steadily deteriorated. After winning the referendum to draft a new constitution, Chavez used his control of the Constituent Assembly to restructure the judiciary and other state institutions. Judges who were seen as insufficiently loyal to Chavez were removed, and new judges who supported the government were appointed. The Supreme Court became packed with Chavez loyalists, and it consistently ruled in favor of the government in disputes with the opposition. The National Electoral Council, which was supposed to be an independent body, came under government control. Opposition politicians and media outlets faced harassment and intimidation. Several television stations that were critical of the government were forced off the air or subjected to heavy fines. Journalists faced threats and sometimes violence. The government also created parallel institutions outside the normal structures of government, including communal councils and a civilian militia. These were presented as examples of participatory democracy, but critics argued that they were really mechanisms for the government to bypass democratic checks and control the population. By 2010, Venezuela's economic problems were becoming severe enough that they could no longer be hidden or blamed entirely on external factors. On June 2nd of that year, Chavez declared an economic war against Venezuela's upper classes, claiming that they were sabotaging the economy through hoarding and speculation. This marked, in the view of many analysts, the true beginning of the economic crisis that would later devastate the country. But Chavez himself would not live to see the full consequences of his policies. In June 2011, he announced that he had been diagnosed with cancer and was undergoing treatment in Cuba. For the next year and a half, Chavez traveled repeatedly to Cuba for treatment while trying to maintain his grip on power in Venezuela. He won re-election in October 2012, defeating opposition candidate Enrique Capriles Radonsky with 54% of the vote. But Chavez's health continued to deteriorate, and in December 2012, he announced that his cancer had returned and that he would need another surgery. Before traveling to Cuba for the operation, he made a televised address to the nation in which he named his vice president, Nicolas Maduro, as his preferred successor should he not survive. Chavez never returned to public life after that surgery. He missed his scheduled inauguration in January 2013, sparking a nationwide debate about whether he was still legitimately president. On March 5, 2013, Maduro announced to the nation that Hugo Chavez had died. Maduro became acting president, and a special election was scheduled for April 14th to choose a president to serve out the remainder of Chavez's term. The election was held between Maduro and Capriles, who had also been Chavez's opponent in the 2012 election. The campaign was bitter and contentious. Maduro presented himself as the true heir to Chavez's legacy and promised to continue the Bolivarian Revolution. Capriles argued that Venezuela needed a change in direction to address the country's mounting economic problems. The result was extremely close. Maduro won with just 50.62% of the vote, a margin of only 235,000 votes out of nearly 15 million cast. Capriles refused to accept the result and demanded a recount, alleging widespread irregularities. The National Electoral Council ordered an audit, but Capriles refused to participate when the council declined to examine voter signatures and fingerprints as he had demanded. Nicolas Maduro Moros was a very different figure from Hugo Chavez. Born on November 23, 1962, in Caracas, Maduro grew up in a family of modest means. His father was involved in leftist politics and the labor movement, and Maduro followed a similar path. Rather than attending university, Maduro went to Cuba for training as a political organizer. He worked as a bus driver in Caracas and became a representative in the Transit Workers Union, eventually rising to a leadership position. In the early 1990s, Maduro became involved in the movement to free Hugo Chavez from prison after the failed coup attempt. It was during this time that he met his future wife, Celia Flores, a lawyer who was representing Chavez. After Chavez was released and entered politics, Maduro became one of his closest allies. He was elected to the National Assembly in 2000, and over the years, Chavez appointed him to increasingly important positions. He served as president of the National Assembly from 2005 to 2006, then as Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2006 to 2012, and finally as vice president, starting in October 2012. But Maduro lacked many of the qualities that had made Chavez such an effective political leader. Chavez had been charismatic, a gifted speaker who could connect emotionally with audiences and inspire passionate loyalty. Maduro, in contrast, was a wooden speaker who often appeared uncomfortable in public. Chavez had been a bold, decisive leader who dominated Venezuelan politics through force of personality. Maduro seemed uncertain and reactive, more of a political operator than a commanding presence. Chavez had enjoyed genuine popularity among Venezuela's poor, who saw him as one of their own who had risen to power to defend their interests. Maduro had no such personal connection to the masses. He was known primarily for his loyalty to Chavez rather than for any achievements of his own. These differences would prove crucial as Venezuela's crisis deepened. When Maduro took office in April 2013, he inherited an economy that was already in serious trouble. Oil production had continued to decline, and the problems that had been masked by high oil prices during the boom years were now becoming apparent. Inflation was running at approximately 30% per year, and shortages of basic goods were widespread. The government's fiscal deficit was large and growing, as spending continued to far outpace revenues. Foreign exchange reserves were depleting rapidly, and the gap between the official exchange rate and the black market rate had become enormous. Venezuela's international credit rating had been downgraded to junk status, making it difficult and expensive for the government to borrow money. Maduro's response to these problems was to continue the policies that Chavez had implemented, even though those policies had contributed to the crisis. He maintained price controls, even as they led to worsening shortages. He continued to print money to cover the government's deficit, even though this was fueling inflation. He kept the currency control system in place, even though it was creating massive distortions in the economy. Like Chavez, he blamed the country's economic problems on an economic war being waged by wealthy businessmen and foreign enemies, particularly the United States. Instead of addressing Venezuela's economic problems, Maduro focused on consolidating his political power. He used the government's control of the judiciary and electoral system to harass and imprison opposition leaders. Media outlets that criticized the government faced fines, closure, or confiscation. In 2014, after protests erupted against the government's handling of crime and the economy, Maduro ordered a violent crackdown that resulted in dozens of deaths. Unlike Chavez, who had at least maintained a facade of democratic legitimacy, Maduro increasingly ruled as an authoritarian. In 2015, with Venezuela's economy in free fall, voters handed Maduro's United Socialist Party of Venezuela a devastating defeat in parliamentary elections. The opposition coalition won a two-thirds majority in the National Assembly, which should have given them the power to check Maduro's authority. But Maduro, supported by the Supreme Court and other institutions he controlled, simply refused to recognize the Assembly's authority. The court ruled that the Assembly was in contempt and stripped it of its powers. In 2017, Maduro convened a new constituent assembly to rewrite the constitution, bypassing the elected National Assembly entirely. The election for this new assembly was widely denounced as fraudulent, and the opposition boycotted it. The new constituent assembly was packed entirely with Maduro supporters. As Maduro's political control tightened, Venezuela's economy was collapsing at a pace rarely seen in peacetime. The decline was so severe that it would eventually be compared to the economic catastrophes of the Great Depression in the United States or the collapse of the Soviet Union. The proximate cause of the economic collapse was the fall in global oil prices that began in 2014. In mid-2014, oil was selling for over $100 per barrel. By early 2016, it had fallen below $30 per barrel. For an economy as dependent on oil as Venezuela's, this price collapse was catastrophic. But while falling oil prices triggered the crisis, they were not the root cause. Other oil-producing countries experienced economic difficulties when prices fell, but none experienced the total collapse that Venezuela did. The real problem was the structure of Venezuela's economy and the policies that Chavez and Maduro had implemented over the previous decade and a half. Venezuela had failed to save money during the boom years when oil prices were high. While countries like Norway and Saudi Arabia had built massive sovereign wealth funds to provide a cushion against future downturns, Venezuela had spent every dollar it received and more, running large fiscal deficits even when oil prices were at their peak. When the crash came, there was no cushion. The government had to cut spending drastically or borrow money to make up the shortfall. Maduro initially tried to continue spending at previous levels by printing money and depleting Venezuela's foreign exchange reserves, but this only made the crisis worse. As the government printed bolivars to cover its deficit, inflation began to accelerate rapidly. In 2014, the inflation rate was 69%, the highest in the world. In 2015, it reached 181%, again the highest in the world and the highest in Venezuela's history up to that point. In 2016, it hit 800%. By 2017, Venezuela had entered a period of hyperinflation, defined as inflation exceeding 50% per month for at least 30 consecutive days. The inflation rate for the year reached approximately 4,000%, but this was only the beginning. In 2018, according to estimates by the International Monetary Fund, Venezuela's inflation rate exceeded 1 million%. Some economists put the figure even higher, at over 1.7 million%. In 2019, the IMF initially estimated that inflation would reach 10 million% by the end of the year. These figures are almost impossible to comprehend. They meant that prices were doubling every few weeks or even days. A Bolivar note that could buy a meal one week might be worth only enough to buy a piece of candy the next week. The currency became essentially worthless for conducting transactions. Venezuelans increasingly turned to U.S. dollars for purchases, creating a dual currency system. Those who had access to dollars, whether through remittances from relatives abroad or through black market currency trading, could survive. Those who depended on wages paid in bolivars saw their purchasing power evaporate almost overnight. The Venezuelan government attempted to address the hyperinflation through a series of currency reforms that did nothing to address the underlying problems. In August 2018, the government introduced a new currency, the sovereign bolivar, which was worth 100,000 old bolivars. In practical terms, this meant removing 5 zeros from the currency, but without addressing the fundamental problem of the government printing money to cover its deficit. The new currency immediately began to lose value just as the old one had. In October 2019, the government announced another redenomination, this time removing 6 more zeros from the currency. Again, this cosmetic change did nothing to halt inflation. The hyperinflation had devastating effects on Venezuela's economy and society. Businesses that could not adapt to the constantly changing prices were forced to close. Those that remained open struggled to obtain inventory, as suppliers were reluctant to accept bolivars that would be worth less before they could spend them. Banks became essentially useless for saving money, as any. Funds deposited would lose most of their value within days or weeks. The collapse in the value of the bolivar was accompanied by an equally dramatic collapse in Venezuela's GDP. Between 2013, when Chavez died, and 2017, Venezuela's economy contracted by more than 1/3. The decline continued after that. By 2020, Venezuela's economy had shrunk by approximately 73% from the start of the crisis, measured in per capita terms. This made it the 15th largest economic crisis in modern history and the largest outside of war, revolution, or state collapse. To put this in perspective, during the Great Depression, the U.S. economy contracted by approximately 30%. Venezuela's economic collapse was more than twice as severe. The contraction in Venezuela's economy exceeded that experienced by Germany after World War I, by Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, or by Zimbabwe during its own hyperinflation crisis in the 2000s. Only countries that had experienced total war or complete state failure had seen comparable declines. Oil production, the foundation of Venezuela's economy, collapsed along with everything else. By 2020, Venezuela was producing less than 500,000 barrels per day, down from nearly 3 million barrels when Chavez took office. This decline was due to years of underinvestment, poor management, corruption, and the departure of skilled workers. Facilities that should have been maintained were allowed to deteriorate. Wells that should have been drilled were never started. When equipment broke down, there was often no money or expertise available to fix it. The decline in oil production created a vicious cycle. Less production meant less revenue for the government, which meant less money available for investment in the oil sector, which led to further declines in production. International sanctions imposed by the United States beginning in 2017 made the situation worse by cutting off Venezuela's access to international financing and making it difficult to sell oil. But these sanctions came after the crisis had already begun, and most analysts agree that Venezuela's self-inflicted economic policies were the primary cause of the collapse. As the economy collapsed, Venezuela's transformation into one of the most dangerous countries in the world accelerated. The homicide rate, which had been climbing steadily throughout the Chavez years, reached truly catastrophic levels under Maduro. By 2015, Venezuela had a homicide rate of approximately 92 per 100,000 people, making it the second most violent country in the world after Honduras. In 2016, the Venezuelan Violence Observatory, an independent monitoring organization, calculated that the country had suffered 28,479 violent deaths that year, translating to a rate of 91.8 per 100,000. To understand how extraordinary this figure is, consider that the World Health Organization classifies any homicide rate above 10 per 100,000 as an epidemic of violence. Venezuela's rate was nearly 9 times that threshold. In Caracas, the capital city, the situation was even worse. The homicide rate in the capital metropolitan area exceeded 130 per 100,000 in some years, making it one of the most dangerous cities on earth. The reasons for this explosion of violence were multiple and interconnected. The economic crisis created desperation that drove many people, particularly young men, to crime as a means of survival. As formal employment opportunities disappeared and the value of wages evaporated due to hyperinflation, criminal activity became one of the few ways to earn money that maintained its value. Armed robbery, kidnapping for ransom, and drug trafficking all increased dramatically. The Venezuelan state's capacity to maintain law and order collapsed along with the economy. Police forces were understaffed, poorly equipped, and often underpaid. Officers who were paid in bolivars saw their real wages decline to almost nothing due to hyperinflation. Many police officers could not afford to eat properly or to pay for transportation to work. Some turned to corruption or criminal activity themselves to survive. Others simply abandoned their posts. The number of police available to patrol streets and respond to crimes declined dramatically. The judicial system, which had been dysfunctional and politicized under Chavez, became almost entirely non-functional under Maduro. Courts were backlogged with cases that could take years to be heard. Prosecutors lacked the resources to properly investigate crimes. Prisons were so overcrowded that many criminals could not be incarcerated, even when convicted. The result was a climate of almost complete impunity for criminals. According to some estimates, more than 90% of crimes in Venezuela went unpunished. When criminals face no realistic prospect of being caught and punished for their crimes, the deterrent effect of the law disappears entirely. This encourages more criminal activity and leads to a breakdown of social order. Venezuelans learned that they could not count on the state to protect them. Those who could afford to hire private security guards or move to gated communities did so. Those who could not afford such measures lived in constant fear. Kidnapping became a particularly prevalent crime during the crisis years. The Venezuelan charity Observatorio Venezolano de Violencia estimated that there were approximately 20,300 kidnappings in the country in 2009 when Chavez was still in power. By 2016, under Maduro, the non-governmental organization PDVSA estimated that a kidnapping occurred in Venezuela every 7 minutes. Both wealthy individuals and ordinary people became targets. Express kidnappings, in which victims were held for short periods and forced to withdraw money from ATMs or have their families deliver small amounts of cash, became common. Longer-term kidnappings of wealthy individuals or their family members for large ransoms also increased. Families who paid ransoms often did so in US dollars, as bolivars were essentially worthless. The kidnapping epidemic created a climate of fear that changed how Venezuelans lived their daily lives. People avoided certain areas, altered their routines to be less predictable, and became extremely cautious about displaying any signs of wealth. Venezuelan prisons became scenes of humanitarian horror during the Maduro years. The prison system, which had been designed to hold approximately 15,000 inmates, held more than 55,000 by 2016. Conditions in these overcrowded facilities were appalling. Inmates often lacked adequate food, water, medical care, and sanitation. Violence within prisons was rampant, with rival gangs controlling different areas and settling disputes through armed combat. Prison riots and massacres became regular occurrences. In August 2017, a fire during a riot at a police detention center in Valencia killed 68 people. In May 2020, a riot at the Los Llanos prison left 47 people dead and 75 wounded. Prison guards often had little actual control over what happened inside the facilities. In many prisons, gangs ruled through violence and intimidation, extracting money from inmates and their families and controlling access to food and other necessities. The economic crisis and rising violence triggered a massive exodus of Venezuelans from their country. The migration that resulted represents one of the largest displacement crises in modern Latin American history. According to data from the United Nations, High Commissioner for Refugees, more than 7.7 million Venezuelans had left the country as of mid-2024, representing approximately 1/4 of the country's population. This migration occurred rapidly, with the majority leaving after 2015 as the economic crisis reached its most severe phase. Venezuelans fled to countries throughout the region and beyond. Colombia received the largest number, hosting more than 2.8 million Venezuelan migrants and refugees. Peru took in approximately 1.5 million. Ecuador, Chile, Brazil, and Argentina also received hundreds of thousands of Venezuelan migrants each. The United States became home to more than 500,000 Venezuelans. Smaller numbers reached Mexico, Central American countries, and Europe. The Venezuelan migrants faced enormous challenges in their destination countries. Many left with almost nothing, as the collapse of the Bolivar meant that any savings they had were worthless. They often walked across borders, carrying only what they could carry in backpacks. Some families were separated, with men leaving first to establish themselves and then sending for their wives and children later. In their destination countries, Venezuelan migrants often faced discrimination and difficulty finding employment. Many were forced to take jobs for which they were overqualified, working as street vendors, delivery drivers, or domestic workers despite having university degrees or professional experience. Some destination countries provided legal status and assistance to Venezuelan migrants, while others implemented restrictive policies to try to limit the influx. The mass migration created tensions in receiving countries, which struggled to provide services to large numbers of new arrivals. In some places, particularly in border regions that received the largest numbers of migrants, local communities experienced strain on their schools, hospitals, and housing markets. The migration crisis was both a symptom and a cause of Venezuela's decline. It was a symptom in that people were fleeing the unbearable conditions created by economic collapse, crime, and political repression. But it also made the crisis worse by draining Venezuela of human capital. Those who left tended to be younger, better educated, and more entrepreneurial than those who remained. Doctors, nurses, teachers, engineers, and other professionals left in large numbers, creating critical shortages in key sectors. The loss of these skilled workers made it even harder for Venezuela to recover from its economic collapse. Hospitals that had already been struggling with shortages of medicine and equipment now also lacked sufficient staff. Schools lost teachers, and the quality of education declined. Businesses could not find qualified employees. The healthcare system in Venezuela, which had been a source of pride during the early years of the Bolivarian Revolution, collapsed during the crisis. The Barrio Adentro clinics that had been established with such fanfare in the early 2000s fell into disrepair. Many were abandoned entirely, with the Cuban doctors who had staffed them returning home as Venezuela could no longer afford to pay for their services with oil. Hospitals suffered from chronic shortages of medicine, medical supplies, and functioning equipment. Operations that should have been routine became life-threatening due to lack of anesthesia, antibiotics, or other essential supplies. Patients were often required to bring their own supplies to the hospital, including bandages, gloves, and even cleaning supplies. Dialysis machines stopped working and could not be repaired. X-ray machines and MRI scanners broke down and remained broken for months or years. The infant mortality rate, which had been declining for decades, began to increase. The maternal mortality rate also rose sharply, as hospitals lacked the equipment and supplies needed to handle complications during childbirth. Malnutrition became widespread as food shortages intensified. A survey conducted by Venezuelan universities in 2017 found that approximately 64% of Venezuelans had lost significant amounts of weight during the previous year due to inadequate food. The average weight loss was 11 kilograms, or approximately 24 pounds per person. This phenomenon became known colloquially as the Maduro diet. Children were particularly affected by the food crisis. The same survey found evidence of stunted growth in children due to chronic malnutrition. Infant mortality from malnutrition-related causes increased. Schools that had once provided meals to students could no longer do so, as the government programs that had funded these meals ran out of money. Some children fainted at school from hunger. Parents made agonizing decisions about which family members would eat and which would go hungry. The Mission Merkel program, which had provided subsidized food during the Chavez years, continued to operate but could not meet demand. Lines at Merkel stores often stretched for blocks, with people waiting for hours in hopes that trucks would arrive with food. When trucks did arrive, fights sometimes broke out as desperate people competed for scarce supplies. The collapse of Venezuela's currency and economy led to bizarre distortions in daily life. At various points, Venezuela's minimum wage, when converted to US dollars at the black market exchange rate, fell to less than $2 per month. This meant that workers earning the minimum wage could not afford to buy even the most basic necessities for their families. Pensions for retirees, which were paid in bolivars, became essentially worthless. Elderly people who had worked their entire lives found that their pensions could not even buy them enough food for a single day. Many became dependent on remittances from relatives who had fled the country. The government issued money in increasingly large denominations in a futile attempt to keep pace with inflation. By 2018, the largest denomination bill was 100,000 bolivars, which at the time was worth approximately 30 cents on the black market. In 2020, the government issued 1 million bolivar notes, but even these had minimal purchasing power. The electricity grid, which had been unreliable for years, suffered increasingly severe and prolonged failures during the Maduro years. In March 2019, Venezuela experienced a massive nationwide blackout that left most of the country without power for nearly a week. Hospitals lost power, and patients died when ventilators and other critical medical equipment stopped working. Pumps that supplied water to homes stopped functioning, leaving millions without access to water. Refrigerated foods spoiled. Businesses could not operate. The blackout was caused by failures at the Guri Dam hydroelectric facility, which provides approximately 80% of Venezuela's electricity. The facility had been poorly maintained for years, and when a fire damaged critical equipment, the entire system collapsed. Smaller blackouts became regular occurrences throughout the country. Even when power was available, it was often unreliable, with frequent fluctuations that damaged appliances and electronic equipment. Venezuelans learned to live with uncertainty, never knowing when the lights might go out. The water supply system also deteriorated dramatically. In many parts of the country, piped water became intermittent or stopped flowing entirely. Pumping stations lacked fuel or electricity to operate, and pipes that broke were not repaired due to lack of materials or funding. Venezuelans had to collect water from wells, streams, or natural springs, often carrying it long distances in containers. The lack of clean water contributed to outbreaks of waterborne diseases. Cases of diseases that had been largely eliminated, such as diphtheria, measles, and malaria, returned as the healthcare and sanitation systems collapsed. Cholera, which had not been seen in Venezuela for decades, reappeared. The government initially tried to hide the extent of these outbreaks, but eventually had to acknowledge them as they became too widespread to conceal. Maduro's government responded to the crisis not by changing course, but by increasing repression and tightening its grip on power. Opposition leaders were arrested on trumped-up charges. Leopoldo López, one of the most prominent opposition figures, was arrested in 2014 and held under house arrest for years. Other opposition leaders fled into exile to avoid arrest. In 2018, Maduro held a presidential election that was widely condemned as fraudulent. The main opposition parties boycotted the election, and many candidates were barred from running. Maduro claimed victory with 67% of the vote, but turnout was low and international observers declared the election illegitimate. The United States, Canada, the European Union, and many Latin American countries refused to recognize Maduro as the legitimate president. In January 2019, Juan Guaido, the head of the opposition-controlled National Assembly, declared himself interim president of Venezuela, arguing that Maduro's re-election had been illegitimate and that the presidency was therefore vacant. More than 50 countries, including the United States, recognized Guaido as Venezuela's legitimate president. This created a bizarre situation in which Venezuela effectively had two presidents, each claiming to be the legitimate leader of the country. Maduro retained actual control of the government, the military, and the country's institutions, while Guaido had international recognition but little actual power inside Venezuela. Guaido attempted to organize mass protests to force Maduro from power, and at times hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans took to the streets to demand change. But the protests were not sustained, and Maduro's security forces were ultimately able to maintain control. In April 2019, Guaido called for a military uprising to overthrow Maduro. Some military units declared their support for Guaido, but the uprising quickly fizzled when most of the armed forces remained loyal to Maduro. The attempt to remove Maduro through a combination of international pressure, mass protests, and military defection had failed. Maduro had survived, and his grip on power actually appeared to strengthen in the aftermath of the failed uprising. Opposition figures who had participated in or supported the uprising faced increased repression. Some were arrested, while others fled into exile. Guaido's position became increasingly tenuous, and his popular support within Venezuela gradually eroded as it became clear that his strategy was not going to succeed in removing Maduro from power. The United States and other countries imposed extensive economic sanctions on Venezuela in an effort to pressure Maduro to step down. These sanctions targeted the oil industry, the banking sector, and individuals associated with the Maduro government. The Trump administration in particular pursued a maximum pressure campaign, imposing new rounds of sanctions and attempting to cut off Venezuela's access to international financing and trade. The sanctions made Venezuela's economic situation worse by making it harder for the country to sell oil and to import goods. Maduro and his supporters argued that the sanctions were the primary cause of Venezuela's economic crisis, and they used this argument to rally nationalist sentiment and deflect blame from their own policies. International observers and economists generally agreed that while the sanctions exacerbated Venezuela's economic problems, they were not the primary cause. The crisis had begun years before the most severe sanctions were imposed, and it was rooted in the economic policies that Chavez and Maduro had implemented over nearly 2 decades. Maduro maintained power through a combination of military support, Cuban assistance, and control of state institutions. The Venezuelan military remained largely loyal to Maduro, partly because senior officers benefited financially from their positions, and partly because Cuban intelligence and security personnel helped to monitor and control the armed forces. Cuba provided thousands of advisors and intelligence operatives who worked to maintain regime security and identify potential dissidents within the military and government. Russia and China also provided important support to Maduro. Russia supplied military equipment and advisors, while China provided loans and continued to buy Venezuelan oil despite international sanctions. Iran also developed a relationship with Venezuela, providing fuel shipments during critical shortages and purchasing Venezuelan gold to help the regime obtain hard currency. The political situation in Venezuela remained stalemated through 2020 and 2021. Maduro controlled the government and the country's territory, but he lacked legitimacy both domestically and internationally. The opposition was divided and demoralized after the failure of its attempts to remove Maduro from power. Juan Guaido's interim presidency became increasingly irrelevant as time passed, and he proved unable to leverage his international recognition into actual power. In 2020, Maduro's supporters held parliamentary elections that were boycotted by most opposition parties. The Maduro-aligned parties won an overwhelming majority, and the government once again controlled the National Assembly. The opposition-led National Assembly, which had been elected in 2015, was effectively dissolved, and with it went Juan Guaido's main claim to legitimacy. By 2021, approximately 20 years after Chavez had launched his Bolivarian Revolution, the results were devastatingly clear. Venezuela, which had once been the wealthiest country in South America, had become one of the poorest. The economy had shrunk by 3/4, inflation had reached incomprehensible levels, and most of the population lived in poverty. The country had become one of the most dangerous places in the world, with homicide rates that exceeded even war zones. 1/4 of the population had fled the country, creating the largest refugee crisis in the Western Hemisphere. The political system had become authoritarian, with opposition suppressed and democratic institutions hollowed out or eliminated. The humanitarian crisis was profound, with widespread malnutrition, collapsed healthcare and education systems, and intermittent access to basic services like electricity and water. The differences between Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro were significant and consequential. Chavez, whatever his faults and the damage his policies caused, had been a genuinely charismatic and popular leader who inspired passionate loyalty from his supporters. He had a vision for transforming Venezuela, even if that vision proved to be deeply flawed in practice. He had the political skills to build and maintain a broad coalition of support. He was able to use Venezuela's oil wealth to fund social programs that, at least temporarily, improved the lives of many poor Venezuelans. Maduro, in contrast, lacked charisma, vision, and political skill. He inherited a country that was already in economic crisis, and he proved incapable of addressing the problems he faced. Rather than attempting real reforms, he doubled down on the failed policies of his predecessor. When confronted with economic collapse, he resorted to repression rather than changing course. Chavez had ruled during a period of high oil prices when Venezuela's oil revenue was sufficient to mask the structural problems in the economy. Money from oil exports allowed him to fund generous social programs and to subsidize food, fuel, and other goods. When shortages appeared, there was enough money to import goods to fill the gaps. The problems created by his economic policies were real, but they were not immediately catastrophic because oil money could paper over them. Maduro ruled during a period of lower oil prices, when all of the structural problems that Chavez had created or exacerbated came home to roost. The decline in oil revenue meant that there was no longer enough money to continue subsidizing everything. The government had to make hard choices, and Maduro's response was simply to print money, triggering hyperinflation. The economic collapse that occurred under Maduro was the inevitable result of the policies that Chavez had implemented, but Maduro's own policy choices, particularly his decision to finance government spending by printing money, made the crisis far worse than it needed to be. Chavez had maintained at least a facade of democracy, holding regular elections and allowing some space for opposition, even as he systematically undermined democratic institutions. He won elections, albeit sometimes amid accusations of irregularities, and he could point to his electoral victories as evidence of popular support. Maduro abandoned even the pretense of democracy. When he lost elections, he refused to accept the results and used the courts and other institutions he controlled to nullify opposition victories. When his own re-election was widely seen as fraudulent, he simply ignored the criticism and used force to maintain power. Under Maduro, Venezuela completed its transformation from a democracy with authoritarian tendencies into a full dictatorship. The inflation that plagued Venezuela under both Chavez and Maduro deserves special attention, as it was one of the most destructive aspects of the crisis. Inflation had been persistently high during the Chavez years, typically running between 20 and 30% annually, but it remained at levels that, while problematic, were manageable. Under Maduro, inflation spiraled completely out of control, reaching levels seen only in the most extreme historical cases. The mechanism that drove this hyperinflation was straightforward. The government was spending far more money than it was taking in through taxes and oil revenue. Under normal circumstances, a government facing such a deficit would either cut spending, raise taxes, or borrow money. But Maduro did none of these things effectively. Cutting spending would have meant ending the social programs and subsidies that were the foundation of the government's remaining popular support. Raising taxes was difficult because the economy was shrinking and much economic activity had moved to the informal sector. Borrowing money from international markets was impossible because Venezuela had defaulted on its debts and was cut off from international credit markets. The government's solution was to simply print money. The Central Bank of Venezuela, which was under government control, created bolivars out of thin air to cover the government's deficit. This massively increased the money supply, and basic economic theory predicts what happens when the money supply increases rapidly while the supply of goods and services remains constant or declines. Prices rise. The more money the government printed, the higher inflation went. And as inflation rose, the government needed to print even more money to cover its spending, because the money it was printing lost value almost as soon as it was created. This created a vicious cycle in which money printing led to inflation, which required more money printing, which led to more inflation, and so on. At the peak of the crisis in 2018, the money supply was growing at rates exceeding 100% per month. This is why inflation reached such astronomical levels. The human cost of hyperinflation was immense. People who had savings saw their life's work evaporate. A person who had saved money for retirement found that their savings could not buy even a single meal. Workers who were paid in bolivars had to spend their wages immediately, because by the next day the money would be worth noticeably less. Businesses could not plan or invest because they had no way of knowing what prices would be in the future. The entire concept of money as a store of value broke down. This forced people to spend enormous amounts of time and energy simply trying to survive economically, time and energy that could otherwise have been used productively. The economic calculation necessary for a functioning market economy became impossible when prices were changing by the hour. This contributed to the collapse in economic activity and the flight of businesses and investment from Venezuela. Different economic actors were affected differently by hyperinflation. Those with access to US dollars were largely insulated from the worst effects. This created a sharp division in Venezuelan society between those who had dollar income, whether from remittances, black market currency trading, or employment with foreign companies, and those who depended on wages paid in bolivars. Government employees, pensioners, and workers in the formal sector who were paid in bolivars saw their real incomes essentially disappear. Teachers, nurses, police officers, and other public sector workers found that their monthly salary, which might have been enough to live on a few years earlier, could now barely buy a few meals. This drove many of these workers to leave their jobs and either migrate from the country or try to find work in the informal economy where they might be paid in dollars or in goods. The government made various attempts to address the hyperinflation problem without actually addressing its root cause, which was excessive money printing. In addition to the currency redenominations already mentioned, the government also attempted to launch a cryptocurrency called the petro, supposedly backed by Venezuela's oil reserves. The petro was announced in 2017 as a way to evade international sanctions and to provide a stable store of value. The government claimed that the petro would be worth $60 and that it could be used for various transactions, including paying taxes. But the petro was widely regarded as a scam. It was not truly a cryptocurrency in any meaningful sense, as it was controlled entirely by the Venezuelan government. There was no evidence that it was actually backed by oil reserves as claimed. Few people inside or outside Venezuela were willing to accept petros as payment. The entire project appeared to be mostly a propaganda exercise, though the government did force some public sector workers to accept part of their wages in petros. In 2020 and 2021, there were some signs that the worst of Venezuela's hyperinflation was moderating. Inflation remained extremely high by any normal standard, but the triple-digit monthly rates that had characterized 2018 and 2019 eased somewhat. Several factors contributed to this moderation. The government reduced the rate at which it was printing money, partly because the economy had become so dollarized that printing bolivars was less effective as a means of financing government spending. The use of US dollars for transactions became increasingly common and eventually quasi-legal, with the government tacitly accepting dollarization, even though the bolivar remained the official currency. This dollarization helped to anchor prices and reduce inflation. The government also made some modest moves toward liberalizing the economy, allowing more private economic activity and easing some price controls. These changes were limited and grudging, and they came only after the economy had already collapsed. but they did help to stabilize the situation somewhat. However, even as inflation moderated from its worst levels, the damage to Venezuela's economy and society had been done. The economy remained approximately 1/4 of its former size. Poverty was widespread, with most Venezuelans living on just a few dollars per day. Infrastructure had deteriorated to the point that even basic services could not be reliably provided. The exodus of human capital continued, with educated and skilled workers still leaving the country when they could. The political situation remained authoritarian, with no clear path toward democratic restoration. International sanctions remained in place, making it difficult for Venezuela to access international financing or to rebuild its oil industry. The country's international reputation had been severely damaged, and foreign investors who might have been willing to put money into Venezuela in better times were extremely wary given the political instability and history of expropriations. Looking at the full arc of the Bolivarian Revolution. From 1999 to the early 2020s, a clear pattern emerges. The revolution began with promises of social justice, equality, and an end to corruption. It mobilized Venezuela's poor and marginalized populations and gave them a sense that they had a champion in power. In its early years, backed by high oil prices, the revolution did produce some positive results, including reduced poverty and improved access to healthcare and education for many Venezuelans. But the revolution was built on fundamentally unsound economic foundations. It depended entirely on oil revenue and made no effort to diversify the economy or to build sustainable institutions. It systematically destroyed the productive capacity of the Venezuelan economy through nationalizations, price controls, and currency restrictions. It concentrated power in the executive branch and undermined democratic checks and balances. It fostered corruption and mismanagement on a massive scale. When oil prices fell, these underlying weaknesses were exposed. The social programs that had been funded by oil revenue could no longer be sustained. The government, rather than adjusting to the new reality, attempted to maintain spending by printing money, triggering hyperinflation. The destruction of the productive economy meant that there were no other sources of wealth that could substitute for oil revenue. The concentration of power in the presidency meant that there was no effective check on disastrous policy decisions. The result was a complete economic and social collapse that reduced Venezuela from one of Latin America's most prosperous countries to one of its poorest and most dysfunctional in the span of less than a decade. The transformation of Venezuela into one of the most dangerous countries in the world was perhaps the most tragic aspect of the entire crisis. In the early 1980s, before the Bolivarian Revolution, Venezuela had been a relatively safe country with homicide rates similar to the United States or other moderately developed countries. By the late 2010s, under Maduro, Venezuela had one of the highest murder rates in the world, exceeded only by El Salvador and Honduras, both of which were grappling with endemic gang violence. This transformation was directly related to the economic collapse and the failure of state institutions. As economic opportunities disappeared and poverty became endemic, criminal activity became one of the few ways to make a living. As the state's capacity to maintain law and order collapsed, criminals operated with impunity. The result was a breakdown of social order that affected every aspect of Venezuelan life. The Venezuelan case offers important lessons about economic policy and political institutions. It demonstrates the dangers of building an economy around a single commodity, no matter how valuable that commodity might be. Oil wealth allowed Venezuela to avoid hard choices and to paper over serious structural problems for many years. But when oil prices fell, all of those problems came home to roost. The case also demonstrates the dangers of concentrating political power and undermining democratic institutions. The erosion of checks and balances under Chavez allowed Maduro to continue with disastrous policies even when their failure was obvious, because there were no effective mechanisms to constrain his power or to hold him accountable. Independent institutions like the judiciary, the electoral system, and the media, which might have served as checks on executive power, had been captured or destroyed. The Venezuelan case also illustrates the human cost of economic mismanagement. Abstract concepts like hyperinflation and economic contraction translate into real suffering, malnutrition, preventable deaths from lack of medical care, families torn apart by migration, lives cut short by violence. The people who suffered most from Venezuela's collapse were those who had the least to do with creating the crisis: ordinary working people, the poor, children, and the elderly. the political leaders who implemented the policies that caused the crisis, in contrast, largely insulated themselves from the worst consequences. Many high-ranking officials in the Maduro government reportedly amassed significant personal fortunes through corruption, even as the country collapsed around them. As of the early 2020s, Venezuela's future remained deeply uncertain. The Maduro government showed no signs of willingly relinquishing power, and the opposition appeared unable to mobilize the popular support or international pressure necessary to force change. The economy had stabilized somewhat from its worst point, but it remained in a depressed state with no clear path toward recovery. The massive exodus of Venezuelans had drained the country of much of its human capital, and most of those who had left showed little inclination to return given the conditions in the country. The political situation remained authoritarian and repressive, with opposition figures harassed, imprisoned, or exiled. International sanctions remained in place, limiting Venezuela's access to international markets and financing. Some observers held out hope that a negotiated political transition might be possible, perhaps with international mediation. There were occasional rounds of dialogue between the government and opposition, sometimes mediated by outside parties like Norway, but these talks produced little concrete progress, as the government and opposition had fundamentally incompatible positions, and neither side seemed willing to make the compromises that would be necessary for a real agreement. Other observers believed that change would only come through Maduro's death or through a military coup, but both scenarios carried their own risks and uncertainties. There was no guarantee that whoever succeeded Maduro would pursue better policies or would be more democratic. The reconstruction of Venezuela, whenever and however it begins, will be a massive undertaking. The country will need to rebuild its oil industry, which will require enormous investment and expertise. It will need to restore basic services like electricity, water, and healthcare that have largely collapsed. It will need to reform its currency system and bring inflation under control. It will need to rebuild democratic institutions that have been hollowed out or destroyed. It will need to address the security crisis and restore law and order. It will need to create conditions that might convince some of the millions of Venezuelans who fled to return and contribute to rebuilding their country. All of this will require sustained effort over many years, significant financial resources, and competent, honest leadership. Given the depth of Venezuela's crisis and the challenges it faces, recovery is likely to be slow and difficult even in the best case. The story of Venezuela's Bolivarian Revolution and subsequent collapse stands as one of the most dramatic economic and political catastrophes of the early 21st century. It took a country that had significant advantages, vast oil reserves, a relatively educated population, democratic traditions, and reduced it to a state of dysfunction and misery through a combination of ideological rigidity, economic mismanagement, and authoritarian governance. The revolution that promised to empower the poor and create a more just society instead impoverished nearly everyone and created widespread suffering. The government that promised to fight corruption became deeply corrupt itself. The political movement that claimed to be democratic became authoritarian and repressive. For future historians and policymakers, Venezuela offers a cautionary tale about the dangers of populism, economic mismanagement, and the concentration of power. It demonstrates that good intentions and revolutionary rhetoric are no substitute for sound economic policy and strong democratic institutions. And it reminds us that countries can fall much further and faster than many people believe possible.